Welcome to ITI's podcast. We call it Download on Tech. ITI is the global trade association of the technology industry, representing the world's technology innovators. When you listen to episodes of Download on Tech, you'll hear from leaders at the most innovative technology companies, from policymakers, and from influencers from around the world. Our guests share their perspective on the intersection of innovation and public policy. Today, our guest is Dell Technologies' Dr. Vivek Mohindra, who is Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy. Vivek works closely with Dell's CEO and COO to develop strategies that maintain Dell's market leadership. Vivek, welcome to the show.
Jason, delighted to be here. We have had a long association with you and your organization, and I'm delighted to be a guest on your program.
Well, we are proud of that literally decades-long partnership between Dell and ITI, and really appreciate your being here to share with us the excitement at Dell and in the tech industry around artificial intelligence. And in fact, I was recently reading some commentary from Dell about what a critical moment we're at in artificial intelligence. And this is really the year, a critical moment for global governments to maximize the potential of AI. Can you elaborate and share your vision? What do we mean when we talk about this being a critical moment for global governments to maximize AI?
You know, AI, in our view, as you have heard of described before, Jason, we truly believe that AI is a multi-decade tailwind. And the pace at which it is getting incorporated is accelerating quite significantly. And you may have noticed that it is accelerated so much, and it has achieved so much potential and visibility that even the two of the Nobel Prizes that are awarded this year, the chemistry and physics, were squarely in this particular area. So against this backdrop, when you think about what we hear from our customers and what customers are doing and planning to do to harness this technology, and you think about the role that governments have to play, this really is a critical year, in some ways an inflection point for governments to really comprehend what they need to do. And as we think about it, when you step back and think about the role governments play, you know, clearly there's one part of it which is around empowering their citizens to achieve whatever they need to achieve with using AI. The second part clearly is around thinking through how AI plays into the national interests of the various governments. And the third is thinking through what environment they need to create to ensure that the companies will continue to accelerate the adoption of AI to be able to realize the society benefits that it can unleash for the citizens of different governments. So governments have a hugely critical role, and given the pace at which this is moving, we strongly believe that governments really, really need to step up, and this is the year for them to step up. And then, of course, you layer on sovereign AI on top of that, which then requires governments to really think about what does it mean for them, what does it mean for the data, what does it mean for the implementation to make sure that these models capture the essence of a culture, the language, the data, the contextual elements of that. So these models are really, really useful in the context of what the citizen of their government need. So this is really the year for the governments to step up in quite a meaningful way.
Really interesting. And I want to go back a couple of sentences there to this notion of sovereign AI that you were talking about. This is a phrase we hear a lot about, but we don't hear it defined very well. And in addition to asking you to help us understand what you mean when you talk about sovereign AI, particularly when you talk about it to governments, I'm also curious how Dell is making itself a part of this conversation around sovereign AI.
Yeah, sovereign AI has come into vernacular over the last year or so. I think it's really being driven by when governments think about how to best use AI for their needs and their population's needs. And it takes multiple forms. You know, it takes the form of first the data, because when you really look at the models that are getting trained by and large, on the publicly available information, many of these models are getting trained in the languages which are not native to many governments around the world. So then it begs the question, how do you use the data that is reflective of your own culture, your own particular context, and make sure that these models are reflective of that? So that's clearly one element of sovereign AI. The second element of sovereign AI is, once you have comprehended the data and the model aspects of it, is the infrastructure you need to set up. So what is the infrastructure that the governments need to set up to make sure that not only does it fulfill their needs, which range from being able to serve their population better, but also their national security needs as may exist, but equally the needs of the broader economy that they have. What infrastructure do they need to set it up so the small and medium businesses, for example, which may not have access to these models, can use these models and AI techniques to really further the interest and drive the economic growth that a lot of those types of companies drive. So sovereign AI encompasses both the data aspects of it, the infrastructure aspects of it, to really bring it into a much more localized and locally pertinent context for the government. And I was sorry, after your second question, in terms of the role we are playing, we think that the government's needs are very similar, more expensive, but very similar to businesses in that regard. So this is really, we are working with a lot of governments in terms of helping them think through which use cases make sense for them, what type of data do they think they need, both in terms of local data as well as broader data, and really help them think through how to implement this in the most responsible way for their particular needs. So we are quite involved with a lot of governments around the world.
I'm glad you brought up that notion of collaboration between industry and government, because I wanted to ask for your perspective on that and what you hear and what the Dell team hears when having these conversations with government. Obviously, collaboration is helpful, and it's particularly helpful when it comes between government and companies like Dell and organizations like ITI that are global in their scope. We can bring the perspective of what's worked and what hasn't worked in other geographies when we're having conversations with governments about the proper regulatory regime and the importance, particularly in AI, of preventing international regulatory fragmentation that may deny the benefits of innovation. And there are a lot of global groups that are working on these issues. I was in India when the G20 was there talking about AI. I was in Singapore earlier this summer talking about the G7 efforts around AI. There are a lot of them going on. What are your views on the best ways in which government and industry can work together to try to harmonize as best as possible these AI policies?
Yeah, you hit it. I think it's critically important for the government and companies and industry to collaborate in this dimension. And we at Dell certainly welcome it. Just like you, I was in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago. I was in Mexico City a couple of weeks ago, and I spent quite a bit of time speaking with the government. And it's very clear, and you hit upon this notion of shared regulatory framework. Whether we like it or not, all companies and all industries operate in a global context and a beyond local context. So when we start thinking about regulations, for example, that the governments are appropriately trying to put in place, there's a real risk of these regulatory frameworks becoming very patchwork, either within a country level or beyond a country level. So, and there's also a risk in that the regulations end up stifling innovation in some form, or constrain the ability for industry to innovate, which would be a shame because it would really minimize, or it would not maximize the societal benefit that can be accrued from these types of technologies. So from our perspective, collaboration is hugely important between industry as well as governments. And there's got to be a shared framework which provides companies and industry transparency and some certainty within which be able to innovate. And similarly, I think the governments have an obligation to think through how to balance the different risks that originate within these technologies too. And this is where industry can really help, working with the governments closely together to help strike the right balance. So I am completely with you in the points you made that you have already discovered through your world travels. My experiences tell me the same thing, and we welcome that, and we have been working with the governments in many areas on that.
So let's drill down a little bit on this, about this innovation-focused policymaking that you're advocating to global governments. I think we have a clear understanding that this is essential for AI development, but I want to ask you for some specifics around some of the broad principles that you're suggesting should guide policymakers in creating both effective and obviously balanced regulatory frameworks.
I think there are certain principles that need to be in place. From my perspective and our perspective, there's clearly one element which has to do with the ability to allow companies and industry to innovate. There is another consideration which is around user and societal good that can be accomplished with these types of technologies. And then there's another dimension which is around growth and innovation piece of it. So as we think about the principles that should be in place, the first is clearly being able to balance these considerations. The societal good with the risks that come with it, as well as allowing for sufficient growth and innovation from there. So the first principle is being able to balance these three with active dialogue and discussion with the industry. The second principle, which is very clear, just given at the pace at which this technology is moving, is that the regulatory frameworks need to have the right agility in them to be able to be adaptive as newer constructs and newer considerations come into play. So if the governments end up creating regulatory framework which are too inflexible to be able to comprehend some of these newer developments, then there's a risk that there won't be enough certainty, regulatory certainty, to allow the companies and the industry to innovate, to be able to provide the maximum benefit to the users and society that it can actually unleash. So I think those are the most important principles to put in place. And then I think the third principle would revolve somewhere around at the intersection of trust, security, and efficiency in some form. As governments think about whatever that framework is, which is shared and not a patchwork, it has the right elements of trust, security, and efficiency in there. This is not an easy task by any means, but at least our view is that by closely collaborating with the industry, the governments can achieve the right balance on these dimensions and meet the spirit of these principles.
One of the questions I get a lot traveling the world, and I bet you get it too, is governments asking about investments that are necessary for the success of AI. And they mean investments both in infrastructure, in technology and innovation, but also in people and talent. And so when you think about what's going to make AI adoption globally really take off, what are the specific investments in infrastructure and talent that you think are crucial to making that happen?
Yeah, both of those are really important dimensions. And I am really glad you brought forth the talent piece of it as well. Let me start with the talent piece. I was looking at some historic data. It's always sometimes interesting to look at history. It may not repeat, but it certainly rhymes in some dimensions, as they say. 60% of the jobs today did not exist in 1940. 85% of the new jobs created since 1960 have been because of technology innovation. When you look at even one of the Nobel Prizes awarded this year for chemistry around protein structures, it used to take scientists years to uncover the structure of a protein, but with the use of these tools, all of a sudden, there's now millions, hundreds of millions of protein that have been determined in terms of their structures, which has now then allowed the scientists to think about what to do with these structures, how to think about new drugs and new types of discoveries. The point in citing these statistics, Jason, is that our view and my view is that AI will end up impacting a lot of roles in many, many different ways. There are some estimates which talk about up to 40% of the workforce will need training. My personal view is that pretty much every role out there will get impacted in some dimension. And this is where the governments really, really need to step up and think through how to reskill their citizens and their people, and the reskilling will take multiple forms. It will take the forms of teaching some of the fundamentals so people understand what this technology is all about. And it'll require upskilling them in terms of how to use these tools for the jobs they do. Because one of the most beneficial aspects of these AI tools now is that it is making these tools accessible to people with non-technical backgrounds. Previously, you needed, even for something like software coding, there are tools which allow you to create software code in a zero code or a no code environment, or the outputs of the software code. So suddenly, these tools make it much more accessible to a lot more people out there. So governments have a huge obligation to, on the skilling side of it. We, for example, are doing our part. We have implemented a 4-module AI fundamental training for all of our team members globally, which gives them the basic understanding. We have created 101, 201, 301 level courses so people can specifically think about these tools in the context of their roles. And it's the same principle that the government needs. The second part you mentioned, equally important, is the infrastructure element of that, because there is a real risk if the governments don't think about infrastructure, and clearly in the context of sovereign AI that we were discussing earlier, then there's a real risk that it leads to segregation of who within an economy can really take advantage of these types of tools. And as we were talking earlier, a lot of the small and medium businesses end up being engines of economic growth in vast majority of the countries out there. So the governments have an obligation to think through what infrastructure do they need to put in place to allow for accessibility of these tools to broader set of companies in their environment so they can actually take advantage of these types of technologies. And both of those will require great thought and great investment. And the good news is that companies like us are working with not only businesses and government, and we can help them there. But those are the two areas that the government will have to spend a lot of money on. Final point on infrastructure would be around the sustainability dimension of that, because there will be these types of infrastructure do have energy requirements which are very different from before, have power requirements very different from before. All of the players who are putting it out there in terms of infrastructure, including us, we're doing our part to make sure that what we put out there is the most energy and cost efficient, including, for example, advising companies and businesses and governments to use, for example, a PC to do some of these types of tasks rather than automatically thinking of very big data centers, which tend to consume more power and tend to be more costly as well. So those are some of the other elements on the infrastructure side that the governments will have to really think through and make the investments in.
And with all those investments on the table, there does, of course, have to be some prioritization of that. And I wanted to ask you about how Dell thinks through the prioritization of projects and investments. I've had the privilege of being down there in Austin and seeing a lot of the incredible work you're doing around sustainability. The supercomputing center that you run down there and the liquid cooling capabilities of it are just absolutely astounding to see. Never thought I'd see a computer sitting in liquid and running at high speed before. But across the board, how does Dell think about prioritizing projects or investments, particularly in AI, you're talking about all these societal goods that can come from AI. How do you prioritize projects that are focused on solving societal challenges?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Jason, and it's in many ways the thought process is an extension of how we think businesses should also think about it, and like how we think about it. So I'll talk specifically about how we think about it, and there's an extension and analogy to how we think about the societal good part of it. So the way we've thought about it for ourselves and how we use AI to make ourselves a much better company is thinking very carefully about what makes us unique, what makes us special, what gives us a competitive advantage, and in the context of our business strategy. And then with those use cases in mind, which we have 5 of based on our unique operating advantages and people and culture, we then have systematically thought about what data to use, and therefore how to go about implementing them in the most sustainable manner. So that's the principle that we have had for ourselves. And that's the principle we have shared with all our customers, whether they're on the public side or the private side. So it's the same analogy for the governments as well. So we are working closely with governments to help think through what are the use cases they should be prioritizing. For example, the city of Amarillo, they had an issue with providing services, city services to a population, most of whom are not native English speakers. There are many different languages being spoken, but they clearly have an obligation to provide the city services to them. So we work closely with them to understand what that particular use case was, what data they need for that, and what is the most efficient and effective way to implement that. So what we have been doing is bringing those principles to bear to work with a lot of these governments, both at all levels, local, state, and national level, to help them figure out what those use cases are and then ensure that those get implemented in the most responsible way possible.
Makes good sense. You've talked about the need for collaboration as part of this, and I wanted to ask you to elaborate on what kind of collaboration models you've seen work well to move all of this forward, and maybe an example of a successful collaboration effort do you think might be a model for the industry?
Yeah, the collaboration models are really, really important over here for all the reasons we were discussing earlier. And in general, these collaboration models take 3 different forms. They take the form of industry to industry, company to company type of collaboration models, which are largely in the private sector domain. They take the form of private sector with the government type of collaboration model, which tend to be the most powerful. And then, of course, there's collaboration model between government to government type of collaboration models. So I think the EU Act, which provided the framework, would be an example of the last one. We have been a part of the OECD through their AI Community and Business Roundtable, which is yet another example. We've also been part of the AI Governance Alliance of the World Economic Forum, which provides for the collaboration framework between different companies at a global level, but then also have some public sector representation on that. And then similarly, the EU-US Trade and Technology Council Summit is another example of that. The good news is there are many of these constructs out there, again, at all 3 levels, and that's the type of collaboration that would be needed to ensure that the society can take benefit of these technologies.
Let's look into the looking glass, if you will, and project into the future for the conclusion to our conversation. We all know that AI has the potential to transform society, and we all hear it about how it's going to transform industries and that the next few years are going to be the decade of AI. But of course, as we've been talking about, governments and policymakers play a very big role in whether this is actually going to come to fruition or not. So what are your aspirations for how policymakers can play a positive role in the changes that AI is going to bring in transforming society, transforming industries? What should policymakers be thinking about as they hope to transform and shape this future?
Yeah, policymakers have a hugely important role over here, Jason, because of a lot of things we have talked about during our conversation. Policymakers need to think through how they provide some regulatory certainty to the industry, so it doesn't freeze the industry or subject it to patchwork of regulations, which fundamentally imposes a tax on the entire system to be able to extract the maximum societal good. That's clearly one element of policy that the regulatory bodies and government officials need to think through. The second aspect of it is the required flexibility and agility. Within this framework, how do the policymakers create the agility to be able to comprehend newer types of developments that come about, and how do they provide that? The third thing policymakers really need to think through is what we were just touching upon. How do they make sure that the skilling part of the workforce continues at the pace at which the technology itself is moving? Because if there's any mismatch between the two, then the ability for skills to be kept up will get impaired, and that is not good in terms of being able to provide the maximum societal benefits of that. And the fourth things the policymaker need to think through is the infrastructure piece that you talked about earlier. What kind of an infrastructure should they be putting in place to make sure that the people can continue to extract the benefits from this over decades that which this is going to come about? So those are the four areas that policymakers, in our view, should be paying attention to. And all of it will need to come at a speed at which the technology is moving, which is not an easy challenge, but certainly one that everybody will face.
Indeed, and I appreciate your efforts to travel the world, helping policymakers understand the important role that they play. You and your Dell colleagues are constant presences in world capitals and telling the good story of the benefits to society, of the advancements that AI will bring, and the work that policymakers need to do to make it a reality. Vivek, it's been a true pleasure to have you on the program today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on AI, on technology strategy, and the role of public policy in fostering all this innovation.
Jason, delighted to be here, and I'm glad that you got a chance to come to Austin to see all the innovation we have in place. I look forward to meeting you in person the next time you are here, and thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. Look forward to my next trip there. If for no other reason than my oldest niece is a Dell employee, and I'm a big fan of the company and have been for a long time. So look forward to seeing you in Austin or somewhere around the world talking about AI policy in the very near future. Our guest today has been Dr. Vivek Mohindra, who is Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy at Dell Technologies. And thank you to our listeners and viewers for joining us for today's episode of Download on Tech. You can find future episodes of Download on Tech on our website, itic.org, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. I'm Jason Oxman, ITI's President and CEO, and I look forward to connecting with you next time.